welcome everybody to GeoHug. So I'm very excited. We've got Ali Jaffri with us today. But before we do kick off today's session, I would like to take this time to acknowledge the traditional lands which we're all coming from today. I live on the beautiful lands of the Gadigal, of the people of the Aurora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and future. And yes, I'm very excited that we have Ali Jaffri joining us today. So Ali is the CEO of Applied Stratigraphics and has 25 years of experience in geology projects. He's trained over 1,000 geologists and engineers from 70 companies in 12 countries. And it is going to be absolutely brilliant learning from him today about putting the sedimentology back into sediment-hosted metal exploration. So this is going to be a fantastic session. I hope you all enjoy it. Please don't be shy. I'm going to be promoting you up as panelists. Please come through if you can. You're welcome to get your camera on, get your mic on. We'll open up for some great discussions at the end. And yes, if you're not able to chat, definitely use the chat and we can read out any questions or comments that you have. But yes, thank you so much, Ali, for joining. It's awesome having you here today.
No, thank you so much for having me, Jessica. I appreciate it.
No, it's brilliant. I was curious before we start, what got you into geology to begin with?
You know, Jessica, I grew up in the Himalayan foothills in northern Pakistan.
Wow.
And my parents would take me to the mountains every weekend. And my dad owned a bookshop. I could just walk into the bookstore, get any book I wanted. And I was 7 when I read about fossils and that the Himalayas used to be under the water. I was like, all right, then I should be able to find fossils there. And I found a fossil and I was like, you know what, I'm pretty good at this. And I was 7 and I decided to be a geologist and I never changed my mind.
That's incredible. Wow.
Yeah.
And what an awesome place to grow up in. That must have been, I've always wanted to go check it out there. That's amazing that you got to grow up in that sort of place.
Yeah, no, I was very fortunate.
What has been, so I imagine you have traveled a lot with your roles. So what's been some big standouts for you?
You know, I think of all the places that I get to go to work, I would say Indonesia and Mexico are definitely my favorite places to go so far. It's just not only are they spectacular geology wise, I mean, with Indonesia and both Indonesia and Mexico with the volcanoes. In Mexico, it's just the scale of the outcrops. And then, of course, the people make all the difference. I think in both countries, I feel the people are super hospitable. The food is beyond amazing.
Yeah.
And yeah, so any chance I get to go visit those places, I'm always on it.
Yeah, you're very keen for that. I love that. That's awesome. And yeah, thank you again so much for joining. It's absolutely awesome having you on. If you want to share your screen and we'll get stuck into it.
All right, well, thank you everyone for being here. And for those who will take a look at this talk later on YouTube, because you know, I am a huge fan of GeoHug. And I'm really honored to be on here with some of the most brilliant people in the mining industry, in my opinion. So the background picture that you're looking at, that is where I'm working at these days. It's a property owned by ISO Energy down in Utah. It's a vanadium uranium mine. And according to the Fraser Institute that ranks places based on investment favorability, this is actually the #1 mining jurisdiction in the world for investment right now. And I'm very, very honored to be a part of it. So the plan today is putting sedimentology back into sediment-hosted metal exploration. I think people lose sight that these rocks are indeed sedimentary, and then there's a lot of controlling parameters. And if we develop just even a basic understanding, you don't have to be a hardcore sedimentologist, but even if you have a basic sedimentology and stratigraphic framework in place, that can save us a lot of time and money. So the first thing we have to do is we have to break free from the blobs and benches mindset. Okay, that's step #1. I think the step #1 is acknowledging that we actually have a problem in the mining industry when it comes to understanding sediment-hosted metals. Once we're all on the same page, we admit that, yes, we do have a problem, then it's like, well, how do we solve the problem? And for that, I'm going to give you a few different examples. We'll look at some copper and aeolian systems. We'll look at vanadium and uranium in fluvial systems, uranium and carbonates, and I will conclude by talking about carbonate replacement deposits. And in the background, you see this beautiful exotic copper deposit hosted in fluvial sediments from Arizona. So what exactly is a blob? Well, a blob is what you're seeing in this model. If you look, let me get my laser pointer going here. There we go. So you see that this is supposed to be a model showing the distribution of uranium ore. Okay, the yellows are supposed to be sandstones. This weird looking color is supposed to be shale. And then when you're looking at this, you can see that the uranium ore is just floating. It's just floating in space. Like it's not at the top, it's not at the bottom, it's just sort of just floating in there in these blob-like shapes. Okay, and unfortunately, I see this a lot. I see this a lot, and this is very far from reality. And we're going to talk about where you do find uranium in sandstones. And I can assure you, having visited over 250 mines over the past 5 years in 12 different mining districts, you will never, I have personally never seen uranium just floating around, okay? There are very strong stratigraphic controls on where it occurs, even within a sandstone body. Here's another example of a blob, okay? In this case, the mineralizing fluids are moving along this fault plane. Okay, that makes sense, that's totally okay. They're in this white zone. Here they stick out a little bit more, here they stick out a little bit less. They go into the blue zone and they're sticking out as much into the blue zone as they are into the white. Then they get into the gray zone, which is another formation, another lithology. Even when the mineralizing fluids go from the white into the blue, there's absolutely no change to the geometry. So here's the deal, folks. If porosity and permeability were not controlled by stratigraphy, someone like myself, who's been running a sedimentology and stratigraphy focused consulting firm for the past 12 years, would be out of work. Okay, so collectively in the mining industry, I think it's time we embraced the fact that porosity and permeability is controlled by lithology and stratigraphic architecture in sediment-hosted metal host rocks. Okay, it's a fact. That's just how it works. The folks in the oil and gas business figured this out a long time ago, which is why they actually hire sedimentologists and stratigraphers on their teams to help them find more oil and gas. So I've thought about this a lot. I was like, why is it always a blob? Why do these things always show up as these weird, just random blobby bodies? Like, what's going on? And then it just hit me, during my entire coursework at the Colorado School of Mines, I've probably seen this particular image by Dick Silito on porphyry systems at least 25 times, okay? And I think that's what happens. A porphyry or some sort of igneous intrusion is the ultimate blob. And it's okay. It is okay for an igneous intrusion to be a blob, okay? But we get so used to the idea of seeing these blobs. You see this Dick Silito image all over. People will model these bodies and then they're a blob. And then look, I mean, I like this image because the blobs are different shapes and then they're different colors. And this is what we get used to. These blobs get thrown at us all the time until we're so used to them that we get complacent. And then, they say for someone holding a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And that's what we start doing. We start looking for blobs everywhere. And when we do, then we assume they'll exist in sedimentary systems as well. Now, the complete opposite of the blob mentality is oversimplification, which is a classic example of that is the Kupferschiefer, where people assume that, hey, you know what? There's the shale scattered over half of Europe. And wherever you go and you find that shale, it's mineralized with copper, homogeneous for tens of kilometers in every direction. And that's simply not true. So here's the original Kupferschiefer model. These folks obviously like the model a lot. And this is a deposit in Colombia. And they're like, this model is so cool, we should replicate it. And they did. And according to their model, this red zone indicates where the copper and silver are supposed to be. And you can see that it's just same thickness for miles and miles around, okay? Now, as a sedimentologist, I can promise you that this almost never occurs in nature. It just does not happen. Sedimentary layers pinch out. They always do, okay? There's a really good talk by Gregor Borg, I think it's on Ore Deposits Hub on the Kupferschiefer. I think it's called the Redox Yo-Yo. And I would highly encourage you to go watch that talk, because this is from someone who has done a lot of work on the Kupferschiefer. And this is a figure from one of his publications. And when you look at this, yes, there are places where you get from these sandstones, these silicic into the shale, and right at that interface, yeah, you start getting copper mineralization. But then there are places where there is no mud rock, there is no shale there, yet there is mineralization right at that interface. Then there are places where the mineralization is in the overlying carbonates, and there are places where the mineralization is in the underlying sandstones. Bottom line is, no, it's not as simple as a perfectly laterally continuous surface that just goes on and on forever, and wherever you find it, you find copper in it. It's just not that simple, okay? So what I hope you got from these first few slides is, in real sedimentary systems, this whole idea of the things do not occur as blobs, and we're going to talk about why, okay? So the first example I have for you is from an Aeolian sandstone-hosted copper deposit in Colorado, not too far from where I live. Okay, so for those of you who don't know where Colorado is, this is where we're at. This is where I'm at. I'm in the Front Range. This is right by the Utah border. And this is from a publication from Tim McIntyre that shows mineralizing fluids. These are chloride-rich brines carrying copper. They enter the sandstone. Now that sandstone had hydrocarbons migrate through them. There's bitumen in that sandstone. The bitumen acts as a reductant. When the mineralizing fluids encounter that bitumen, they precipitate out, because copper has an affinity for reductants. Okay, so that all sounds great, but it's not as simple. You know, you can't just put a blob right there. So this is what it looks like in outcrop. Beautiful malachite, azurite, the works. So what makes it more complicated? What's going on? Well, what's going on is Aeolian systems, and for those of you who don't know what Aeolian means wind transported deposits. In this case, the wind is transporting fine sand. In wind transported sandstones, which are Aeolianites, we have very high values of permeability and isotropy. What does that even mean? What that means is fluids have a much easier time going in one direction versus another. Well, why is that? Well, if you're looking at this outcrop image, you can see these four sets right here in this cross ratification. And these are sticking out so much that I can actually go put my lens cap on them and doesn't fall off. So they're sticking out about 2 to 3 centimeters out of the outcrop. Well, why are they sticking out? They're sticking out because they're highly cemented, okay? And they're more resistant to weathering, which is why they're sticking out. Why is that important to fluid flow? Well, it's important to fluid flow because fluids that are going in and out of that screen, in and out of that outcrop, it's 25 times more likely that these fluids are going to go in and out of that outcrop or in and out of your screen right now versus going against those cemented zone. Well, why are they cemented? Well, there's two things that are happening in these Aeolian deposits. First of all, there's grain segregation right at the dune face, finer grains align right at that interface. During early diagenesis, there's capillary action. Moisture is wicked up from the water table along these surfaces. And as that water is coming up, it can bring calcite, it can bring the evaporites. And once they evaporate out, we get early cementation right along that interface. Now, 25 to 1, is an average. Sometimes it's down to 5 to 1, but in some certain cases locally, that permeability and isotropy can be 200 to 1, which means Fluids are 200 times more likely to go in and out of the screen versus through those cross sets. So who cares? Why does this make a difference? Well, let's go back to our Cashin example. Here's the fault. Mineralizing fluids rise up along the fault. Now, in this situation, as those fluids are getting into those porous and permeable sandstones, guess what? They have to go through multiple interfaces because now those fluids have to go against those cross sets, against paleocurrent direction. And they're not going to get very far, okay, because of that permeability and anisotropy that I just talked about. Whereas if you have a fault in this situation, well, guess what? Now those fluids can go out a lot further because they're not having to work against those cemented interfaces. Here's another reason why sedimentology is important in a deposit like that. These swirly looking things, what you're looking at are microbial carbonates. That's stromatolites for the older folks that are watching this talk. Okay, so these are organic buildups, carbonates, formed in the inner dune. And inner dune is the area between two dunes. When it rains, those inner dunes can fill up with water. You can get streams, ephemeral streams going through those. If they fill up with water and the water hangs out for long enough, you can get carbonate precipitation in those ponds and those lakes. And microbial carbonates show up. They're very organic rich. Millions of years later, when you've buried everything, and chloride-rich brines carrying copper, when they go through the system, they find the reductant, and that's where they precipitate out. And this is why all this stuff looks green. It's green because of malachite. So it's important to map out where these inner dunes are, because if you're mining this stuff, you want to stick in this zone where that inner dune is. But here's the deal. The deal is these inner dunes can be horizontal planes, which are fairly flat. They can have some sort of inclination associated with them. They can be continuous, such as these two examples. They can be discontinuous. So again, I mean, think about when you're mine planning. Yeah, this is fairly easy to work with. And you can have a portal right here and a shaft going this way and you'd be just fine. But what if you were in this situation? How smart would it be to start a portal here and start going that way? We want to decrease dilution, and this is the worst case scenario. Okay, so maybe instead of going this way, you want to go in and out of the plane in one of these bodies. So stratal architecture makes a big difference. Now, the next example that I have for you is from vanadium deposits on the Colorado Plateau. These are all the different mining districts where I've worked, and all these data are coming from. So we can't have a talk about metals without an EH-PH curve in there. So the way I want you to think about this is if you're in a fluvial system, there's part of the fluvial system that are oxidized, part of the fluvial system that are reduced. So let's talk about those because that's very important. The channel where you have the permeable porous sandstones where water is actively flowing, that is a very oxidized environment. It is not very conducive to the preservation of organic matter, but it's great because you have porous permeable sandstones. But there's areas around the river that are waterlogged, and those are more conducive to the preservation of organics. Now, why does this make a difference? So here's the river channel right here. Here's the overbank environment. I'm going to show you this pond here in a little bit. This is all waterlogged, okay? Now, millions of years later, when everything is buried and uranium and vanadium bearing fluids, oxidized fluids are going through this stuff, they are migrating along these high porosity permeability channels. These are like highways, and they're going to keep on going. They will not stop. You will not get any vanadium or uranium precipitation until they encounter some sort of reductant. And they're not going to find the reductant inside the channel. Well, where is the reductant? The reductant is all out here, all this vegetation that you're looking at. That is what provides the reductant. So the reductant is in areas that I've highlighted in red, okay? So here's a stagnant water body that I pointed out earlier. This is a fantastic place. This is, if you've got any organic matter that's sitting in there, now it's just sitting in there. And the probability of preserving that organic matter is super high because this is a little bit more anoxic than the oxidized water out there. Why is this important? Well, this is important because this controls the distribution of uranium and vanadium. So all the yellow that you're looking at, that is all carnotite. And what you're looking at right here, all the black specks, those are disseminated organics. So channel cut into the overbank, all that vegetation, broke it apart. All those black specks are all organics floating around in there. Later on, fluids carrying uranium and vanadium pass through, not necessarily at the same time, but when they encounter that reductant, that's where it precipitated out. So usually, instead of just floating around like a blob in the middle of the channel, where do we get the uranium? It's right at the base of these channels. You can also get them at the tops of these bars. After a rainstorm, these point bars, these fluvial point bars are covered with detrital organics. Okay, we've got a bunch of leaves, pieces of bark, things like that. So the tops of those bars can be organic rich. Millions of years later, you've got fluids carrying uranium, vanadium. When they pass through, that's where it precipitates out. So all that yellow you're looking at, that's all carnotite in these organics right on top of the bar. Here is a piece of a lag from the base of a channel. The yellow that you're looking at is carnotite, okay, that contains both uranium and vanadium. The blue that you're looking at is actually azurite, because guess what? Copper also has an affinity for organics, and that's where copper likes to precipitate out. So hopefully what you got out of that last example was that, no, you're not just going to get random blobs of uranium floating around in a sandstone. No, they're controlled by stratigraphy. They're either right at the bottom of a channel, they're at the top of these bars, okay? Now let's look at another example. This is from the Todilto limestone. This is in New Mexico. It's a lacustrine carbonate. And you know what? Until 20, 30 years ago, no one really cared about lacustrine carbonates until the Brazilians found a bunch of oil and gas in these. And then everyone and their mom decided to study these in a lot of detail, which is a good thing because now we know a lot about lacustrine carbonates. And one of the things that we know is that these lacustrine carbonates occur in very discrete belts. They have facies belts. What does that even mean? Well, if this is a lake, here's a cross section. Here, there are no lacustrine, here you may get evaporites, but you're not really going to get those large stromatolites, okay? You're not going to get those organic rich microbial carbonates until you get this part right here. And if you're way out there, well, again, that's not a very conducive place for them to grow. So the bottom line is they are in a very narrow facies belt along the margins of these lakes, okay? Again, why is that important? Who cares? Well, we care because millions of years later, we have uranium-bearing fluids going through these carbonates. And if you're not on that margin, if you're just off that margin where it's mostly dry, there you get TP structures like that. These are all evaporite-rich carbonates, lots of gypsum there, not a good place. Still lacustrine carbonates, but not a good place to look for uranium. Why? Because this is just not the right facies belt. There's no microbial carbonates building up. There's just not enough reductant in that system for uranium entrapment. What about this? You can see that bulbous shape, okay? That's a classic stromatolite right there. You see all the green on there? All that green is thioyamanite, which is a uranium mineral. Why is it precipitating right along those lamina? Because these microbial carbonates, as they're growing, they have these organic rich zones within them, okay, which are sticky, which allows the carbonates to stick on. And because they are organic rich, again, they provide the reductant needed for uranium precipitation, okay? Just in this facies belt, you could go towards the inside of the lake, into the center of the lake. You're not going to find any uranium there. You move further out, you're not going to find any uranium there. So the uranium is concentrated to this very narrow facies belt along the margins of that lake. So we should talk about fluid flow in carbonates because I think there are definitely some misconceptions out there. And I think someone needs to clarify them, and it might as well be me, okay? So I think the number one misconception that we have for fluid flow in carbonates in the mining industry is that You know, you could look, if you watched any of these YouTube talks, there's a lot of YouTube talks or papers out there talking about CRD deposits, and they mention these are hot fluids. They're hot acidic fluids. And as soon as we hear that, we're like, oh man, hot acidic fluids. We're talking about an environment like Kava Ijen in Indonesia, these acidic crater lakes, pH of 1, nasty stuff, you know, sulfur fumes all over the place. No, because you have to remember a lot of these CRDs can be 7 to 8 kilometers from the causative intrusion, which means these fluids have moved through 7 to 8 kilometers of wall rock buffering. They're not acidic enough to burn your legs off like in Dante's Peak. You know, it's just not going to happen. Okay, so I'll tell you this right now. Let's assume those fluids are super acidic. They're crazy acidic, the sort of acid that I would put my cell phone in and it's gone. If there's a rock that looks like this, guess what? No matter what the temperature, no matter what the pH or EH, fluids always take the path of least resistance, which means they're going to, if you've got a rock that looks like Swiss cheese, guess where they're going? They're going through those big holes first. They're not being like, oh, we're going to ignore those big holes. We are just going to somehow magically cannibalize all this rock out here, ignoring those big holes. We are going to create our own porosity and just cannibalize our way through this. No, that's just not how fluids work in sedimentary systems. So fluids are going through carbonates in 3 different ways. Number one, they're going along fractures, and we're going to talk about fractures here in a little bit. They're moving along pores, okay? And that's super critical to understand. Depositional porosity, which I'm talking about primary porosity, which means some carbonates were deposited with greater porosity and permeability than others. And then the third thing is diagenetic porosity or secondary porosity, okay? Here is an outcrop of the Cupido limestone in Mexico. And I want you to look at the size of that cave. That cave is big enough for a school bus to go through. So I want you to think about CRD deposits because this is one of the host rocks, one of the many Cretaceous age host rocks for CRDs in Mexico. They've been studied to death, especially in a CRD context. If there are hot acidic fluids going through this, you know what? They're going through that hole first. That's just how fluids work, okay? And that's not just for CRDs. We are going to talk about CRDs in a little bit more detail. Here's another example. This is the Madison limestone up in Wyoming, or actually, no, this is up in Montana. And you can see these big holes. That's cavernous porosity, okay? A lot of that is not from karstification. It's actually from evaporite solution collapse, but it still created these very large pores. And those allow uranium-bearing fluids to go through those, and that's how you get uranium precipitation. Again, all that uranium is concentrated along these zones where you have a lot of that solution collapse because there used to be an evaporative layer there that's now gone, leaving behind pore spaces. Let's talk about carbonate replacement deposits because I think there's a lot of misconceptions that are out there. You know, and I think I'm hoping we can clarify some of those because I think we have to approach this again from a sedimentology stratigraphy perspective because others have done so. And I mean, there's people that have gotten super creative. They've come up with the UV light thing where you can find the mangano calcite and it's like pink and it's like, ooh, you know, so, but we can't, so let's not, what I'm showing you is a lot more basic, but from a carbonate set strat perspective. So we're looking at the Leadville limestone, which is near the town of Leadville, which is about an hour and a half away. It's known for its CRD deposits. You can see this is what it looks like. Here we've got zebra rock, all that golden that you're seeing, that's all chalcopyrite, and the host rock is dolomite. And people have studied the Leadville limestone to death and these deposits. And here's a paragenetic history. And one of the most important steps in here is karst erosion, okay? Which means one of the first things that happened here is the stuff was deposited, sea level lowered. The carbonate platform was exposed to meteoric fluids, which is just rainwater. And that created porosity that generated permeability, and it set things up. So later on, when hydrothermal fluids came through, again, we've talked about this, where are they going to go? Well, they will take the path of least resistance. So if there's caves, if there's vugs, if there are zones right along those exposure surfaces where we lower sea level, expose that surface, which are called subaerial unconformities, they go on for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers, okay? Now, if you talk to someone who works on carbonate replacement deposits, who's super smart, like, you know, Dr. Peter McGaugh, he will tell you that, oh yeah, these mantos, you know, they've got lateral continuity that goes for tens of kilometers. We're like, okay, cool, sweet. So we're looking for mantos, but what exactly are mantos? Why do they happen to be at that particular location? Well, in most cases, it's either because you have a carbonate that has very high primary porosity and permeability, or it's because of small scale mechanical stratigraphy that we're going to talk about, or it just so happens that they're moving along a sequence boundary or a subaerial unconformity where we've created that permeability. What else happens along those subaerial unconformities? Well, if you have fractures, fluid, meteoric water will sit in those fractures. It increases fracture aperture. Then when you deposit stuff on top, which is more porous and permeable, like in this scale, it's a breccia, all that breccia fills in those fissures, okay? And now guess what? Now if you've got another high permeability streak right here. Now if you've got those hot acidic metal-bearing fluids carrying zinc and lead, as they come through this tight carbonate, tight meaning very low porosity and permeability, and they hit this breccia body, which has higher porosity and permeability, guess what? Now they're moving up this thing. When you take a look at it, you're like, oh, cool, that's a chimney. It's all mineralized. Well, now you know why that chimney is there, okay? And guess what? We can predict where these happen. Now, this is on a pretty small scale. Here's another outcrop example. These outcrop examples are from Utah. Here's an example from a CRD in Mexico where you're seeing a very similar feature. Okay, this is most likely fissure fill. These are all bedded carbonates, and then this is very different material filling in those bedded carbonates. Okay. So again, what happens when ore-bearing fluids encounter vugs and caves along the subaerial unconformity? That's where you get a zone that goes on and on forever. And that's when you get these massive sulfides. Okay, and that's what people will refer to as mantos. But again, well, what is controlling the distribution of those mantos? It's those sequence boundaries, and those can be mapped. Okay, it's a stratigraphic feature. Well, what's with these? Sometimes you look at these and you see these pseudo epithermal looking veins. You know, you're seeing those very familiar textures that the epithermal folks work with, like the coliform and the crustiform textures. And you're like, well, what's going on here? Well, in this case, those hydrothermal fluids carrying the zinc and the lead are moving along fractures that have been there. So I think it's key because, of course, I'm not the first person who's talking about structure and CRD deposits. You know, in fact, there's a really good talk that was with Peter McGaugh was there, Sage Langston was there, and then Lex Lambach, who is a great talk. It's on YouTube. You should watch it. Everyone talks about these big structures and how you should follow big structures. So I'm gonna move away from that. I'm gonna talk about something which happens on a much smaller scale. Okay, this is an area that I've worked on. There's an outcrop in Pakistan that I've worked on for my master's thesis. And I'm standing on the flank of an anticline, and I'm looking right along the hinge line, and you can see everything's very fractured. That's where the vegetation is growing. Then you go right along the fold axis. You can see there's fractures in this layer right here. There's no fractures in this one. And I'm like, well, wait a minute. There's fractures in the lower one. There's fractures in the upper one. Why are there no fractures in this particular layer? Well, that's because here's the classic model. The classic model is right where you have the maximum flexure in an anticline is where you get the most fractures, and they're going to be through going. But in reality, in carbonates, we have this thing called small scale mechanical stratigraphy, which means even the slightest changes in mineralogy will affect how brittle or ductile that rock is. And that rheology makes all the difference. Okay, so if you take if you take a look at this model, this top layer is fractured, very different fracture density than the layer at the bottom because it happens to be thinner. The layer in the middle is not fractured. And if you're thinking, you're like, man, this guy's, he's lost his marbles, this cannot happen. Well, hold my beer. There you go. Okay, here's a picture from an anticline in the UK. Beautiful example of what I just talked about. This layer has a whole bunch of fractures, very high fracture density. This one does not, even though they're right along the axis of that anticline. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is different lithologies. Now, folks have done work on this. They've gone through and they've figured out, like this study was done in Italy, where they realized that fracture density was a function of rheology, which was dependent on which facies you were looking at. And in this study, the subtidal facies had the highest fracture density, and the supertidal facies had the lowest fracture density. So do you think it would be, if you're looking at a carbonate replacement deposit, and you're looking for these veins that are mineralized, would that make a difference? Yes, it would. It would most certainly make a difference. In fact, I can almost guarantee you that as you move from one stratigraphic interval to another, the aperture of those veins is going to change. Okay, the density of these veins is going to change because it's all small scale mechanical stratigraphy. That does make a difference. So the last slide that I'm going to show you is how the oil and gas industry deals with this. Okay, so because in the oil and gas industry, they figured out a long time ago that fractures influence fluid flow in carbonates, and even the most subtle details, bed thickness, how homogeneous the bed is, how much clay is in there, how much silica is in there, how much carbonate is in there. Even within the carbonates, are we talking about limestones? Are we talking about dolostones? All of those make a difference. Okay, so this example I'm showing you is from a unit called the Wolfcamp. And they're drilling horizontal wells in there, but I don't want you to look at these as horizontal wells. I want you to imagine that here's a portal there, here's a portal there. These are two mine shafts. And you can see, here's a scale that's 3.5 miles. They have the exact same trend. So now if you have some vertical fractures going up and down, well, then both of them should intersect the same number of fractures because they have the same orientation. What if you have horizontal fractures going this way? Well, same sort of deal. I shouldn't call them vertical and horizontal. I should say north-south fractures versus east-west fractures. Since both of them have the same trend, if these are mine shafts, they should see the same number of fractures. All right. Now we're going to look at the results from borehole image logs, which are these logs that they run in these wells that measure fracture density. And we're going to see how that's different. So well 1 intersected 731 fractures, okay? 986 deformed beds. Well number 2, which is only 3.5 miles apart, intersected 2,059 fractures and 187 deformed beds. Now let's go back to that image real quick, just so you can see the spacing between these. So remember, almost 2,000 fractures in one, 730 fractures in the other. These things are only about 3 miles apart. Okay, why is there, if these are mine portals, okay, and this is your mine, this is your competitor's mine, okay, you did great because you encountered a bunch of these veins. They didn't, and let's assume these veins are on a CRD deposit, they're mineralized. You have to be able to explain why that happened. So what I'm hoping you get away from this last section on CRDs is, if you're working on a CRD deposit, number 1, have you mapped the facies? Because remember, the facies control the bed thickness, the facies control the rheology, therefore they control fracture density, and fracture density is later on when you've got mineralizing fluids going through, they're going to use those fractures as permeability conduits. Okay, that's where you're going to get the mineralization. That's where you're going to get those veins. So have you mapped those? Have you mapped the subaerial unconformities? We talk about mantos. Everyone knows about chimneys and mantos, but what exactly are they? If there's these subaerial unconformities, did you map those? Do you even know how to recognize those in your host rocks? What are the fracture trends? What's the density like? Does the density change from one stratigraphic interval to another? Because that's important. Does the aperture of the ore-bearing veins change? Again, that is important. Okay, so again, they're just these are things to think about next time you're working with a CRD deposit. So in conclusion, well, why should you put sedimentology back into sediment-hosted metal exploration? Because folks, there are no blobs out there in sedimentary systems. That's just not how it works. You know, that stuff is totally cool if you're working with, you know, porphyries, you know, that's totally okay. But if you're going to work with sediment-hosted metals, these blobs, they just things don't work like that. Okay, so at the district scale, it helps us reduce the search area by highlighting prospective areas within a basin. An example is, you know, when I showed you those channels that have the uranium in them. Well, if the channels are what contain the uranium along their bases, not just floating around, along their bases, along those lags, along bar tops, then wouldn't it be nice to know what the trend of those channels are? Which way are the channels coming from? Which way are they going? How wide are those channels? Okay, because that will dictate where we need to be drilling. At the camp scale, it allows greater accuracy in resource modeling. Well, if we know exactly how thick these intervals are, what their lateral continuity is like, then we can come up with better resource models. Now, at the mine scale, I showed you that example with the copper in the very beginning. Then I showed you an example of the sediment-hosted, the carbonate-hosted uranium. Now, at the mine scale, you can decrease dilution by ensuring that the miners follow the highest grades along key stratigraphic intervals. So that is all I have for you guys today. I hope you found this useful. And at this point, I will take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much. And there was some great imagery in there as well. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat to us about this. That was awesome.